Welcome to the Explainer. So, today we're throwing on our shop aprons and getting our hands dirty. Well, figuratively speaking. We are demystifying the art of custom paint jobs and stencil mastery. You know, when you're looking at this incredibly intricate skull design on a canvas, or maybe a flawless pinstripe swooping around a curved motorcycle fender, and the final result just looks like absolute magic? Well, spoiler alert, it's not magic. It's really just a series of super approachable, foundational techniques stacked on top of each other. So let's dive right in and break down exactly how the pros build these mind-blowing visuals.
Here's the game plan for today's workshop. We're going to start by locking in perfect layouts and foundations. Then we'll compare vinyl masks versus mylar stencils, figure out how to build some serious 3D dimensional depth through layering, and finally, we'll wrap up by bringing it all to life with some organic, gritty detail.
All right, Section 1, Perfect Layouts and Foundations, Mastering the Blank Canvas. Listen, every great custom paint job absolutely requires you to dial in a flawless layout first. Think about it. If your foundation is crooked, no amount of fancy airbrushing is going to save it. To get that perfect base, you need to meet a brilliantly simple, totally old school tool, the pounce wheel. If you haven't seen one of these before, it's basically a small handle with the tiny spiked wheel at the end. You use it to trace over a drawing, and as you roll it, it literally punctures these tiny little holes right into your paper. It is the absolute secret weapon for getting a perfectly symmetrical design, which is absolutely crucial when you're transferring artwork onto tricky curved surfaces, like, say, a motorcycle tank. So here's exactly how you use it to make a template. First up, you take a piece of paper and fold it right down the middle, giving yourself a really solid center line. Then you only need to draw half of your design on one side. Next, you just trace that drawing with your pounce wheel. When you unfold that paper, boom, those punctured holes give you a perfectly mirrored template on both sides. But here is the massive takeaway you cannot forget. You absolutely must get that center line perfectly straight. Practicing aligning your paper templates to ensure a completely accurate, balanced design before you even think about touching the paint is it's essential. If your center line is off, your final artwork is never going to line up when you put it on the vehicle. Prep is everything here.
Okay, moving on to laying out complex designs right on the surface using tape. There are some hard and fast rules you really need to stick to. First, always measure from a set reference point so your stripes actually stay parallel. Next, instead of just kind of eyeballing it, lay down a piece of tape first to act as a visual guide and just follow the natural shape of the part from front to back. Now, when you're trimming your pinstripe, use your razor to very delicately cut just the stripe. Never press hard enough to cut into the actual paint below it. And finally, if you lay out this beautiful fine line tape design, but you aren't going to paint it that exact same day, make sure to mask right over it with some wider tape just to lock it safely in place.
And here is a major pro tip for your layout. When you're pulling fine line pinstriping tape around a curve, you obviously want to apply enough tension to keep the tape straight, but never ever stretch the tape. Seriously, if you pull and stretch that tape too far, it's inevitably going to shrink right back to its original size exactly when you're getting ready to pint, which will completely ruin your crisp lines. Just guide it gently, don't force it.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, Vinyl Masks versus Mylar Stencils, choosing the right masking medium. So now that our layout is completely mapped out, we've got to choose the right medium to block out our custom shapes. We basically have two absolute powerhouses in the custom paint world: vinyl cut masks and reusable mylar stencils. Knowing exactly when to reach for which one is literally going to change how you approach your entire project. Let's compare them. First up, we've got vinyl masks, which you'll usually see cut out on a machine, like a Cricut. Think of these as basically single-use stickers. They're absolutely fantastic when you need a super tight, exact baseline reference. You know, like for a really complex skull covered in tiny teeth and gears, you just apply the vinyl right to the canvas, spray a really light dusting of white paint over the whole area, and instantly you have this perfect map to follow for your shading. Oh, and here's a really great shop hack for you. Instead of buying expensive transfer tape to move the cut vinyl to your canvas, just use cheap, clear shelf liner. When you remove it, just make sure you peel it straight back horizontally. If you pull it straight up, you risk ripping that delicate vinyl right off the canvas, and nobody wants that. On the flip side, we have reusable mylar stencils. Now, these are heavy-duty workhorses, absolutely perfect for repeatable patterns like chains or barbed wire. They've got the super durable 6mm plastic front that can honestly last a lifetime. But here's the true genius part. They have a paper backing. That paper side actually absorbs your wet, reduced paint. This naturally stops wet paint from building up on the edge of the stencil and bleeding underneath to ruin all your hard work. You can easily just use regular masking tape to block off sections of the stencil you don't want to use, and when you're totally done, they just slide right back into their container for the next job. Super easy.
Okay, section 3. Building depth through layering, stacking skulls and chains.
So, how on earth do we take these flat shapes and turn them into mind-bending 3D illusions? Well, I want you to look at this quote from custom paint expert Mickey Harris. When talking about stacking stencils, like a big pile of skulls, he gives this massive warning. If I spray all the way over, it's going to look like the skulls are transparent. Guys, this is the #1 mistake beginners make. If you spray your paint too heavily right across those overlapping stencil edges, the lines just cross each other, and suddenly your solid bone or your solid steel chain looks like a total ghost. It just breaks the illusion completely.
To fix that transparency issue, you absolutely must follow the depth rule. Basically, when you want one object to look like it's safely tucked behind another one, you place the shadowed side of your stencil facing inward toward the foreground object, and the highlighted side facing out. Then you just let the natural overspray from your airbrush gently drift over the edge. You aren't painting it directly. You're letting that soft, drifting overspray naturally create the drop shadow of the object sitting behind it. It's really that simple.
And you apply this exact same logic when you're using Mylar stencils to weave chains or barbed wire. First, you spray your base color, let's say a nice gray, right through the chain stencil. Then, to make the chain actually look like it's realistically looping in and out of itself, you have to isolate those intersecting edges. You can just use a piece of tape or even the edge of the stencil itself to block the paint. Then, you lightly spray some black right at that intersection to push that link backwards into a shadow. Finally, you come back in and hit the forward-facing edges with pure white to pull them right back forward. Just by manipulating shadows and highlights right at those intersections, your completely flat stencils suddenly become heavy 3D metal.
Which brings us to section 4, adding organic, gritty detail, bringing the design to life.
All right, we've got our layout, our masking, and our 3D layers all dialed in. Now, we make this thing breathe. You do this by combining the sharp, crisp edges of your primary stencils with these really cool, specialized organic texture stencils. Because if you just look at a freshly airbrushed skull, it usually looks a little bit too clean, right? But by holding a texture stencil over the area and just giving it a very, very light dusting of paint, you instantly introduce that porous, bumpy, gritty shape of real bone. You don't have to hose the paint on heavily at all. Just a subtle, light hit gives you this incredibly realistic texture in a matter of seconds. Once you've got that texture down, you actually put the stencils away for a minute and go completely freehand. To make the design look realistically beat up and weathered, you just load up your airbrush with some dirty colors, light browns, maybe some bright yellows, and you just freehand a light dusting right over the surface. This tinting process breaks up that pristine white base and makes the artwork look like it's been sitting out in the sun and the dirt for years. It adds just an incredible amount of character. And this brings us right to the final polish. This is that last 10% that makes the artwork truly pop right off the canvas. You come back in with pure white to punch up your ultimate highlights, those really bright hot spots. You might do a little freehand stroking right on the top edges of the teeth just to define them. You can even bring your stencil back into play just to act as a localized shield while you freehand right up against the edge. It's this really masterful dance between the strict, hard edges of the stencil and the loose, organic shading of the freehand airbrush that ultimately gives you a world-class custom finish. And there you have it. We've taken it all the way from a totally blank canvas to a perfectly mirrored layout using a pounce wheel. We've managed our layers with vinyl and Mylar, built deep 3D illusions with drop shadows, and finished the whole thing off with some gritty, organic textures. It really is a highly structured process, but man, it yields spectacular results. So the only thing left to ask is this. Now that you know the secrets behind the layers, what blank canvas will you transform next? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope you're feeling totally inspired to get out there, grab some tape, and lay down some custom paint of your own. See you next time.